So now start gathering questions in your head for the panel while we talk about shutter speed. What advice do you have for people in the use of the tools cameras have for varying the shutter speed at any of these frame rates? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll just point out that it's an issue even in a single program with a single distribution mechanism. Let's say you're shooting sports. If you're going to go to slow-mo, you want to have a short shutter speed or short exposure time so that you will be able to have the dynamic resolution when you do the slow motion that you can see what's going on. But if you do that when you're presenting it at play speed, then everything looks like it's got the strobing that Larry was talking about. So there's a trade-off there. If you're doing sports stuff, you tend to use a shorter exposure time so that you'll get the dynamic resolution. If it's something that you're never going to be doing any slow-mo in, then you're probably better off with the longer exposure time and not having the strobing and having it be smoother.
Larry.
And then we're seeing the very high frame rate cameras beginning to move into the television world, the phantoms and that shoot at hundreds of frames per second. There they will want not so much a short exposure time because they have a sensitivity problem. And so they probably have the shutter slower, but they've got that high frame rate. So, you know, it's different tools, and I think we're going to see them both evolve. But I think the issue of shuttering is quite well known to the television people shooting sports. They're very familiar with what works. Obviously, they might play with it during the day when it's bright sunlight, and in the evening when the light's dropping. They play with aperture and shutter sometimes there too to get the look that they seek.
Doug.
Well, in movies, blurring and a roughly 180-degree shutter is vital to having that illusion of motion work fluidly.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
And it's very well known amongst people who are cinematographers and projectionists in the movie industry, if you shoot with a very narrow shutter opening, it looks very stroboscopic and very juddery because each frame is sharp. There's a very good example of that in a current movie called Secretariat. If you're looking at the hooves of the horses during the race, they shot with an extremely narrow shutter opening. So what you see is a lot of very sharp frames and no blurring. It was like the opening sequence in Saving Private Ryan, which Spielberg shot with a very narrow shutter opening for a certain kind of period effect. But everybody who makes movies knows how important blurring is for 24 frames, and so many movies are made that are, you know, animated films, what I call cartoons or whatever, you know, Toy Story 3 or whatever. They spend a huge amount of computer rendering time to create artificial blur, whereas those frames are naturally like animation frames of sharp computer-generated imagery.
Like any good After Effects operator does.
Oh man, yeah. The render time to do blur is horrendous. And I was at a thing at the VES, Visual Effects Society, a few months ago, and I asked these guys, I said, would you prefer to render 3 sharp frames or 1 blurred frame? They said, oh, 3 sharp frames is much cheaper than 1 blurred frame.
Sure.
Very easy to do. So they would prefer it if they could do it, but they can't really do it. They can't do it that way because you can't blend 3 sharp frames together to get 1 blurred frame. That doesn't work either, unless you have, you know, so don't get me started.
By the way, one tiny tidbit, just taking literally your last point there, when should you use unusual shutter speeds? In today's world, we're more and more often shooting computer screens, and that's a time for using unusual shutter speeds. There are many cameras, you can just dial through the shutter until you find a speed that prevents flickering on the computer monitor.
That's right. Clear scan.
Let's try some questions. I hope we have some good ones. Yes?
This has been a very interesting discussion about blur versus motion. And I want to think back to the original Star Wars, because I saw it, and I know in the summer of '77, because my daughter was born a week later. At the end of that scene, you have the fighter going down the channel about to drop the bomb in the end. And I remember thinking at the time that the background looked fine, but the spaceship in the center was absolutely clear and sharp, even though it was supposed to be moving. It was fixed in the middle of the screen, and it looked like a model on a stick, which, of course, it was. And we're talking about linear, longitudinal blur on things that are moving. What do you do about something like a fixed image that needs that blur to give the appearance that it's in motion, even though it's fixed in the middle of the screen?
I think that's a Doug question.
I mean, I would say my answer to that would be we're in a world now where almost all these visual effects are being created with computer graphics rather than miniatures. And they will introduce an artificial blur if it helps make the shot look more credible to your eye, even though it may not be warranted or it may not be appropriate. But that will happen because they'll see that right away and they'll say, well, why don't we just blur that anyway? So it is a big problem. I mean, way back in 2001, which was film school for me, I mean, we started shooting our miniatures with stop frame camera positions, so every frame of the Discovery spacecraft was sharp, and it looked horrible. We started lighting our scenes with strobe lights, and it just did not work. And that's when we realized, even though the shutter was open for 10 seconds on an F-32 exposure to get the length of the ship, it had to be moving during the shutter opening period to get the natural blur that would occur if it had been shot at 24 frames. So you just let the shutter rotate half closed, half open, half closed, half open, no matter what length of time you were shooting, to get the same blur that you would get with live action. That we accept as okay. It's not okay with me anymore, but it's the standard of the industry.
Thanks, Doug.
Doug, I want to go the other way with it, which, because I know you've done a lot of stuff with ShowScan and the high speeds. Having worked with some of the military-level VR technology that's out there right now, you hit a threshold where the human eye actually gets so much information that it disorients the viewer. Have you run into that issue with the frame rates in ShowScan in normal projection environments and not a virtual reality environment?
Well, I don't know what you mean by disorienting the viewer.
Well, motion sickness.
Well, see, motion sickness is its own animal because motion sickness is when there's a discontinuity between what you see and what you feel with your body. Mm-hmm. So when I've worked on simulation ride attractions, which are really an adaptation of flight simulation technology, I've spent a huge amount of time developing a language whereby the physical motion of the DeLorean car in the Back to the Future ride or something would be so perfectly coordinated with the motion that I've shot the camera with that you don't have a conflict in your inner ear or your brain. And so you don't get motion sick. I mean, there's a lot of rides that nobody pays any attention to that, and the motion doesn't relate to the movie at all, and your discontinuity makes you barf instantly. And we found exactly where the barf point is.
So that's what I was
Do you
referring
use a
to.
barfometer for that?
Yeah, but I think when you get into these extremely wide displays like IMAX, or like ShowScan was, or like even a hemispherical display in a planetarium, you want as high a frame rate as you can possibly get so that there is no blurring, strobing, or juddering or anything at any image motion. And generally, the audience will stick with you if you don't abuse them with, motion that's just too fast for them to knock them back or make them sick. Because you're talking about a vividness and a clarity quality that has nothing to do with Brad Pitt or anybody, looking like he's in a movie, he or she. Because 24 frames is a barrier that keeps movies two-dimensional and within a fixed rectangular frame. It's an art form that's much more akin to painting than immersive reality. So those are different criteria that I do with different kinds of movies.
So then one follow-up on that is 3D. What do you think is the optimal frame rate for 3D?
I think it's going to be 120 or 144, really.
Well,
If you want to make super vivid 3D that's completely immersive and indistinguishable from reality, get up there to very high frame rates.
And
'Cause
why
your brain can absorb it.
And why 144? What's the multiplier that makes that
Oh, it's
attractive?
just that it's one of the standards that is already there because any DLP type projector is flashing it. It's updating
Oh,
its pixels
okay.
at 144 frames.
Got it.
So when you see a 3D movie, you're seeing three flashes in your right eye and 3 flashes in your left eye. So there's 72 and 72, which makes 144. So the switching rate of the pixels can go at that speed.
Got it.
It's just that we're giving them 24-frame movies, so those pixels just sit there and flash the same old thing 72 times until you get to the next one.
Got it.
That's not the way to go if you want fast action.
Chris?
Can you guys talk about the good ways and bad ways to do a 3:2 pull down? Because a Hollywood film goes through an entirely different process to make that happen with $1 million box or whatever than a documentary, which may be doing it out of a deck or their editing system or a different kind of software program. Can you talk about, because you talk about 24p being acceptable for television, but what's the process to get it to that acceptable state that does the conversion?
I would say it's the making of the 24 that's the issue, not the going from 24 to 60. I don't know of any way to go from 24 to 60 other than standard 2-3 pull down, which SMPTE has specified ages ago. If you want to try going the other way, that's tricky. But to go from 24 to 60, it's simply repeating 2 frames and then repeating 3 frames and then repeating 2.
There's no visual difference from a deck, like a DVC Pro HD deck doing that versus the Avid doing that versus a Teranex doing that?
Shouldn't be.
Okay.
I believe so.
Well, there are hardware, there's standards conversion things that are probably a lot better than you're going to get off the shelf in Final Cut Pro or Avid.
Yeah, but if you're just repeating the frame, that's a pretty,
And I would say if you really want to do it perfectly, you could consider taking a 24-frame movie, upsampling the whole thing to 120, for example, by doing an offline image interpolation that's really super, and then downsampling again to get back to 60 or 30.
but then you might lose the film look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When 24p was starting back around the 1999-2000, I was at Sony at the time, and our R&D lab in Britain made an interpolator to take us 24 to 60 rather than the 2.3. And at the time, it was conceded it worked very well. People liked it, but they didn't like the price tag, and it sort of withered on the vine. And
When was that?
that would have been 2000, 2001.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you think that's different now? We've got a
Oh,
lot more
I would say,
horsepower.
no, I think today you'd be able to do it much more inexpensively, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you go back about 20 years before that, there was a company called Acme Cartoon based in Texas, and they came up with a product called the Emulsifilter, and it was designed to make video look like film. And one of the things that it did was take the 60 fields, very smoothly interpolate them to 24, and then go from 24 back to 60